I have a giant warning on my page saying that I'm not going to do a good job with this lesson. There is a warning included here in Philippians chapter 4. There's a reason for that. Paul talks about something that is surpassing all understanding. And so trying to talk about a subject that surpasses all understanding and try to describe that, first to know that, and then to know it well enough to describe that to somebody else is an impossible task. So, knowing that it's an impossible task, we're going to try to do not the impossible, but the reasonable with the impossible. We're going to try it. This is a subject that is really important. The peace of Christ, which surpasses understanding. The challenge that we find in our world is a lack of peace. You know, we're feeling maybe more and more tension lately than we have been before. There is a lack of unrest in our minds and in our hearts. And Paul talks about something that I think all of us want, but sometimes we fail to understand. It surpasses understanding. So I would like to talk about maybe what it is not, and some guidelines that are given here in Philippians chapter 4 to help us with that. And I believe what he means by it's beyond understanding is not that we cannot talk about it and it's unachievable and there's not a process to go through, but it is greater than you can describe. And it works in ways that you can't fully understand. And so hopefully we were able to talk about it. Hopefully we're able to work through Philippians chapter 4 together and gain a better understanding of it. And then once it begins to bloom and blossom in our life, it'll be far beyond any expectation we could have had for it. I want to begin here in verse 1. We're going to read simply verses 1 through 9 together. And I would like to kind of go verse by verse through this and talk about the different points of this. Starting there, verse 1, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, whom I love and I long for, my joy and my crown, stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved. I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I ask you also, true companions, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers, whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, anything worthy of praise, meditate on these things. Will you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. There are concepts that are hard to define, so you kind of begin defining them by what they're not. If you ever talk to somebody what a good watermelon sounds like, that's a really hard description to get across in words. So you have to grab a watermelon, knock a good one, then you got to knock a bad one, say this is a bad one, don't eat this one. The same thing when it comes to a good quality piece of wood. How do you describe what a sound piece of wood is? Well, you have to go on that one and say, well, that's a bad one, and the good ones just don't sound like that. The peace of Christ sometimes could be a little bit like that. It's hard to really describe, so maybe we can begin by what it's not. When we don't have the peace of Christ, anxiety dominates our life. We have a life that is characterized by fear and by worry. It is categorized by doubt and unrest. We have minds that are busy and unquieted. Oftentimes that leads us into anger and contention with one another. If I'm not at peace internally, then I have a tendency to be testy with other people. And being testy with other people usually leads to conflicts with other people. And then I blame them for the conflicts, and the cycle repeats. That's what a life without the peace of Christ is like. Fear and anxiety and worry and doubt and unrest. It is the busy mind that won't let you sleep at night. It's the unease that does not allow you to get things done. It is a distraction throughout the day. That's what you're missing, or that's what you have whenever you miss the peace of Christ here in Philippians chapter 4. But at the same time, we also need to describe, we have this idea of what things would be like if I had the peace of Christ. And I would suggest that maybe it's not exactly the way that we might innately picture it. What I mean by that is, just because we have the peace of Christ that surpasses understanding doesn't mean that you would never have a moment of doubt. I don't think that there's ever that you have no moments of fear. I find Paul has those. Paul, I believe, is kind of a pretty good example of someone who seems to have the peace of Christ. Here in Philippians, whether I live, whether I die, to live is Christ and to die is gain. He has this attitude, but yet whenever he writes about these circumstances over in 2 Corinthians, he tells us, I want you to be aware that I was so burdened beyond my belief, beyond my ability. There was times where he felt overwhelmed, times that he felt doubt or fear, times that he mentions that he, at the end of 2 Corinthians, had unease and kind of lack of sleep because of his anxieties for the church. And so there's a concept we can have some of those things being present in our lives, but not categorized or dominated by those things. We find times where Joshua, who is as we would call him, a fearless leader, experienced moments of doubt and moments of fear, and then had to work through those things. The Christians that are written to and about in the New Testament, they are not criticized for having moments of these things. It's whenever they dwell in them and their lives become overcome with them. The peace of Christ is not listlessness of I just don't care what happens in life and become blasé. And sometimes some people have described the peace of Christ as that way, where you just lose all love of life, and so you just become depressed and apathetic, and maybe that's the peace of Christ. But if you look at Philippians, he begins the book with joy. He talks about rejoicing through chapter 2, chapter 3. It is the biggest theme in the entire book is to rejoice. And that is the antithesis of the depression and the apathy that some people sometimes categorize the peace of Christ. So now that we've kind of described all the things it's not, how do we describe undescribable? How do we convey information that is ununderstandable? Well, I can't. So we're going to do a really inadequate job to talk about it being the calm and the rest that comes from having a deep and defining belief in Christ, knowing that he has complete capability to keep and to guard and direct, that whatever needs taking care of, he has the ability to do so. I don't know how you guys feel whenever you hop into a plane and you know that the pilot has had 30 years of experience, and you hop into the plane and you're... We'll leave Jake out of this. No, we're not there yet, Jake. I'm not going to hop into your plane yet. And you know that he's well trained and he's done this 10,000 times. And you hop on the plane and you fall asleep because the entire thing is really out of your experience, out of your control. No matter how much you worry, you're not going to help that pilot whatsoever. Now, for those who don't like planes, that was a terrible analogy. Or as you ride in a car with somebody that you really trust, are you able to sleep in the passenger seat, knowing that they have it under control for the most part? That's what we're talking about. We get this idea of control is what we're talking about on Wednesday night, where I need to be in control, I need to handle all this. Anxiety builds in us, and yet there can be a calm understanding that a lot of life is out of our hands, and that's a good thing. That whatever comes is going to be by the purpose and the will of God, that he can work all things together for good. We can define it maybe as the calm of the mind that happens inside the storm of life. As he describes it here, it is a peace that belongs to Christ, a peace that he gives to us, and it's a peace that guards our hearts and our mind. So the peace that he describes here is not necessarily an external peace. Not that we're going to get along with everybody that we've ever met. Not that the world isn't going to go to war around us. But inside, between me and God, there is peace. And between my mind and my heart, there is peace. Jesus promised that over in John chapter 16. He says, in the world, you're going to have turmoil. But in me, you will have peace. And so I think that's part of what he is describing here. So The real question for today, though, in just the last few minutes we'll talk about this, is how do I receive this peace? How do I accept it into my life? And we're going to walk through these verses, and I think these verses give a lot of what we need to know. He begins, interestingly enough, with these two women that I can't pronounce their names very well in verse 2. He begins with them. Now, usually Paul would leave all of the greetings, all of the benedictions to the very end of the book. Why does he stick it in here? I think this placement is key to this overall concept. Well, when is it that I have a lot of unrest and unease? Well, when I'm fighting with somebody, that's going to lead a whole lot of not peace in my life. And when I have brothers and sisters who are fighting with one another, that's going to lead to a lot of not peace in my life. And so he says in verse 2, I want you to agree in the Lord. Now, he's not telling them that you just compromise on anything and everything in order to get along. He says you need to agree in the Lord. You give up your axe to grind, you give up your axe to grind, you agree on what God says. I need to start with that process. I need to agree with my brethren in the Lord. If I have a personal axe to grind, if I just have my beliefs the way that I want them to be, if I have my agenda for the church here at Colonial, and I'm going to fight and argue to get what I want here, I'm not going to have the peace of Christ that guards my heart and my mind. It's not going to happen. So I think the placement of these two individuals and their conflict here in chapter 4, describing the peace to follow, this is a key component. That there's a lot of unrest that happens in the church. And then we wonder why in the world we have no peace of Christ that guards our hearts and mind. Well, his point is you need to agree in the Lord. And then verse 3 is maybe one that hits a little harder for some of us. Some of us maybe have that quiet, gentle spirit who really hates conflict, and we really don't argue with a lot of people very much. But verse 3 is you also. So he talks to, here's these two women, you need to agree in the Lord, and then the you becomes a universal you in verse 3 to the church. You help them. You work together through this process. And the wording, again, I think is really important. He doesn't say, okay, half of you decide with Utica, and half of you decide with Syntyche, and you fight it out amongst you. There's a neutral position. Well, not neutral. It's a God position. Everyone agree with God, and you work and help both of them. We're not on your team or your team. I'm not on your side or your side. I'm on God's side. I want all of us to be there. That is the harmony that comes through this process. But how many times in my life have I sat back and think, I just really wish that so-and-so and so-and-so would really get along. I really wish they would work out their problems. And I harbor this anxiety in my heart in my location, and I don't do anything about it. That's my bigger failing. I don't tend to fight with a lot of people. I don't have the heart to fight. I really hate conflict in general. We'll leave all of the examples aside. But along with the idea of not wanting to engage in someone else's argumentation, I also really just hate dealing with other people's arguments. That causes stress in my life. And so I tend to pretend like I'm not stressing and then stress by not helping other people resolve their problems. And Paul mentions me in verse 3. He says, you help these women. Understanding that they had worked side by side within the gospel, and both of them have their names in the book of life, help them. How is it that I can have peace? Well, I need to stop fighting. And if there are people who are having struggles, I need to be the one who begins to help. This is a sole project that's only there for Chad. This is the congregation should work together to get these brethren, or these sisters in this case, to be united, not in idea, but in Christ or in the Lord. How much more peace I have in my mind if I both knew that I wasn't at odds with somebody else and that I've done everything in my ability to help somebody else in their conflicts. There's a lot of peace that comes in saying, I've done what I can do. I have prayed with them and for them. I have mended as many bridges as I can. That responsibility is off my shoulder. There's a lot of peace that comes through that process. And so he begins there. He talks about them in this way, that they need to agree and that the rest of the congregation here in verse 3 needs to help them. And the wording, this unity throughout verse 2 and verse 3 is critical. He doesn't say, well, she's wrong and she's right, or they're both wrong. He says they both have their names in the book of life, and they both work with me for the gospel. Understand that they want to be one, help them to be one. In verse 4, he then says to rejoice always. We need to rejoice in all of life's events. And that's why Philippians is both inspiring and challenging, because we think, that is amazing that Paul, being in the circumstance he was in, found the things to rejoice in. And we get bolstered by that fact. And then when we picture ourselves in Paul's position, we think, I don't know how I would rejoice. It's amazing that he can, but I don't know if I can. But Paul has a life that was trained to rejoice in all of circumstances. In fact, James, as James opens his book, maybe the first book ever written in the New Testament, the very first statement he makes is rejoice in your sufferings, various trials, knowing that there is something good that comes out of it, that the testing produces endurance having its full effect, may be perfect and complete and lacking in nothing. There is a mindset that says that I'm going to rejoice. Now, I believe to a large degree that worry and fear and doubt and negativity are things that we have been trained to respond in. Society, our family, life circumstances trains us, as soon as something bad happens, negative. Be fearful. Be anxious about these things. You worry about what you can control, or worry about the things you believe you can control. Where we have trained ourselves, and we have been trained to have this mindset of fear and anxiety. And Paul begins this paragraph here in verse 4 with rejoice. Always. And in case if you missed it the first time, I will say it again, rejoice. That's not sometimes, it's not only when things are positive, but to have a mind that you have trained to rejoice in all of life circumstances. Looking for the good that God can produce. Looking for the good that God can produce in your life. That is hugely important. He then mentions in verse 5, let your reasonableness be known to everybody. Reasonableness is being rational or open to logic. How many times have you met people who, once they have engrossed themselves and entrenched themselves in fear, they lose all ability to reason with you? They don't want to get out of that mindset of fear. They want to be reasoned with. They don't want to have alternative possibilities given to them. They are just have this heightened mindset of this is how bad things are going to be, and they're always going to be this way. My life will always be terrible, and you can't reason with them. Paul says, you let your reasonableness be known to everybody. Are there times where you are going to fear? I believe the case is going to be yes. There will be things that pop up that you've never prepared for, and fear may spring up in your heart. Well, what happens whenever someone tries to comfort you or talk you down off of that fear cliff? Or you're having anxiety that you're struggling with, you go to someone and say, I'm struggling with this anxiety, can you talk with me about it? And they try to reason you through it, and you just don't want to reason it. He says, you let your reasonableness be known to everybody. Allow people to reason with you through those things. It's a key component. Reasonableness is a necessity. There in verse 5 as well, the next thing he says is for us to remember that the Lord is near. There's a passage over in the book of Psalms, and it's Psalm 34. One of my new favorite verses there in verse 7. This is the passage in Psalm 34 is probably best known for verse 17, 18, and 19. When the righteous cry to the Lord for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all of their troubles. The Lord is near the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. And many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers them out of all of them. That's probably the three most popular, most famous verses from Psalm 34. But my new favorite is actually verse 7, where he says, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. Now, angels crop up in a number of places in the Old Testament, but they're always described as angels or an angel. There's one that comes up over and over and over again through the Old Testament, and he's described as the angel of the Lord. And there is a beautiful narrative that is woven through the Old Testament if you have the time to follow that thread. It's the angel of the Lord who meets with Moses or with Abraham under the oaks of Moriah. And the narrative switches between the angel said and the Lord said. It doesn't happen with any other angel when they talk, but the angel of the Lord, the narrative switches as if God is there himself. It is the angel of the Lord who's in the burning bush when Moses is out in the wilderness of Midian, and he has to take off his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. And again, the narrative switches between the angel said and the Lord spoke. The narrative switches as if God was there or God was present in that circumstance. It's the angel of the Lord who is sent out after Hezekiah prays in 2 Kings chapter 18 and wipes out the Assyrian army. Just one, just the angel of the Lord. It's the same angel of the Lord that appears over to Gideon as you get over to the book of Judges. And he's the one who consumes the sacrifice and then leaves mysteriously. All of that's to say is when David writes here in Psalm 34, he says, the angel of the Lord camps near you, or near the ones who fear the Lord. I don't know if there, right now any more comforting concept of the angel of the Lord camping near me in all of my troubles. It is a powerful, powerful image there in verse 7. And Paul uses very similar wording here as you get over chapter 4 and verse 5. The Lord is at hand. When it comes to my fear and my anxiety and my worry and my doubt and my unrest, remembering that the Lord is at hand. We were going over the Sermon on the Mount on Wednesday. We mentioned that the first time the phrase comes up, "O you of little faith," is in chapter 6. He mentions it 4 more times in Matthew. All of the other occasions ends up being occasions where any of us fear. Okay, any of us would doubt. But all of the times where was with God was at hand. So the storm arises and Jesus is asleep. And do you not care that we're perishing? And he rebukes them with, "O you of little faith, the Lord is at hand." Or as Peter is called out into the water to walk on the water during the middle of a storm, and he begins to sink. Again, you have the "O you of little faith," because the Lord is at hand. And the same thing comes up here in Philippians chapter 4. Do not be anxious about anything. The Lord is at hand. It is a powerful thing for us to simply remember that the Lord is near us, always. If we are near him, then he is near us. If we draw near to him, he draws near to us. And then in verse 6, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. Give all of the anxieties to him in prayer. And I would say, truly express them clearly, definitively. I don't know how your prayers normally go. I find that I kind of get into my rote things. Okay, it's dinner time, so we got to have our dinner list checklist, and then it's bedtime with the kids, and so we go through that. And then when it's my personal time, it's just me around, then I still have my own family and church and health and food, and then sometimes I finally just break out of that checklist mentality and express what I really need to express. And it becomes very different in that. Maybe I'm the only one. I don't know how everyone else prays when you're alone with the door closed. But this is the type of prayer I think that he's talking about in verse 4. That not just, cure me of my anxieties, of I am fearful today of all of the things that happen in the world. Be specific. there is something on your mind. Pray about that something. And we're going to be talking about this in a couple weeks on our Friday night class, which is this Friday night if you guys want to be here at 7. Hint, hint, wink, wink. When it comes to our confessing of sins, the same thing happens when it comes to sins. Oftentimes we just, forgive us of all of our sins that I may have committed or I may not even know about, and then we move on with our day without taking the time to confess them. There's a power in confession. The same thing comes whenever we exercise our anxieties before God. If it's just, cure me of all my anxieties, that's not what he's driving at. I'm anxious about this situation and talking that over with God and giving that to him. And once you express it, then have faith and trust in his love, that he's going to care enough for you to move at your call. Trust in his plan. That is a really hard one. What is it that's happening in my life that I don't want to happen? Well, I don't want it to happen, and I don't think it should happen because I don't want it to happen. And if God's letting me it happen, then maybe his plan isn't the best plan for me. Now, we shouldn't think that way, but if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes we do. I don't want to have to go through this life circumstance right now. I don't have to deal with this. I can't handle this right now. I don't have time for this. I don't have all the extra fun. Whatever it is, we have all of this. I can't. And therefore, God's plan must not be as good as my plan is for me. If God truly works all things together for good, then I need to trust his plan. Same thing with his purpose, that there is a purpose that happens. That's what we see at the end of James. James writes that we would see the purpose of the Lord and be patient in our trials. The same thing happens when it comes to trusting his providence. When I don't think I have enough resources to get through what I need to get through, and I can't see how things are going to be better, to trust in his providence. We've been going through that again on the Sermon on the Mount. You can't get away from the Sermon on the Mount too far. Trust in God's timing. Again, another hard one. How many times do we get impatient with God that things aren't happening when we know that they need to happen? And then later on they happen way, 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 way later than we wanted them to. And then way later after that, and we think, that timing was pretty great. If I could only trust now rather than figuring out 10 years from now that God's timing was good, how much anxiety could I save myself in simply trusting him? I need to trust in God's wisdom, that whatever he asks me to do, whatever he is guiding me through, that's going to be good. I need to ask, and then I need to wait on God. We were there in Psalm 34, Psalm 46, just 12 Psalms later, ends with, again, another very famous couple of verses, where he says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations, I will be exalted on the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our fortress." There is a waiting that needs to happen, and there is a calm that I need to have in that time, where I ask, I express my anxieties, and then I wait, knowing that he has things covered. And we get back to control. When I realize that I'm not the one in control of my life, and that's a good thing. And I think for the majority of what we've been talking about, that's where he gets to there in verse 7. You do not be anxious in everything, but in everything, with prayer and supplications and thanksgivings, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. But there's a finally, so let's deal with the finally. Finally. In verse 8, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, anything worthy of praise, meditate on these things. I need to meditate on good. And I would say simply stop filling your hearts with worldly, earthly, fleshly things and then wonder at the end of the day, why is it that I have no peace? If I fill up my mind with all that tears at my righteous soul, if I am Lot, who looks around me all the day and torments my soul on all that is not godly, and then at the end of the day, lay my head down and wonder, why is it that I can't sleep? Why is it that I have no peace in my heart? Why is it that I have such anxiety in my life? Pretty good reason. I mean, seems logical. So when Paul talks about to the Philippians about the things that this peace of God that they want to guard their hearts and their mind, he tells them to meditate on the things that are just and pure and lovely and commendable. Now, this is my personal soapbox, so you guys can ignore me for a couple of seconds. I don't think that we are designed as people to be people who hear all of the negative things that happen around the globe continually. I don't. I think that we are to be people who are in our community and see what happens around us and the things that we can do, and then do those things, and then be at peace with that. And we spend a lot of time soaking our brains in the worst that the world has to offer, and then wonder why in the world that all our mind offers back up to us is the worst the world has to offer. I need to be godly towards my family and fellow Christians. I need to be an example to those in the community around me, to give all my anxieties to God and then let Him deal with that. To soak my brain inside of His Word. In Psalm 119 in verse 7, he says, I have treasured, or I have hidden your word in my heart. That's what he's talking about here in Philippians chapter 4. God is not going to care about how many song lyrics you have or how many world events you have cataloged in your brain. He's not going to care about how many artists you know or how much politics you understand. But He will value very much on the day of judgment that you have stored what is pure and just and commendable in your hearts. That's going to be far more pleasing than current events and world news every time. So when it comes to the peace of Christ, I want that. And I fully expect that it's going to be far better than I can ever describe to anybody. But to have that, I need to really agree with my brethren in the Lord. I need to work for that. And I see other brethren, I need to work with them to agree in the Lord, so that inside the church we can have peace, so that in my heart I can have peace. I need to learn to not react with fear and worry and negativity when in life's events. I need to have a mind that is trained to rejoice in all things. I need to be reasonable, so whenever I do have some of those things spring up in my heart, that people can talk me back down from those things. I need to remember that the Lord is near and there is no greater comfort than that. In all of life's storms, I need to be someone who does not have little faith because the Lord is near. He encamps around those who fear Him. I need to give all my anxieties to God in prayer and really, truly, and completely trust that He has the right plan, providence, purpose, love for me, and wisdom in my life. He's got those things covered in a way that I cannot. And I need to soak my head. I need to meditate on the good and not the bad. That is the recipe that I think Paul lays out for us here in Philippians chapter 4. And sometimes I have been guilty of pulling that phrase in verse 7 out of context and just, well, you need to have the peace of God, and you need to have the peace of God, and never really taking the time to walk through the process that He's laid out for us. And so I've thoroughly enjoyed spending time this week just in these verses in Philippians chapter 4. And I hope that you guys will spend some time this week working through the same process and seeing the same purposes there in Philippians chapter 4. Lee has picked out number 835 for us as a song of invitation. The peace of God only comes whenever you're at peace with God. And that only comes whenever we submit fully to Him. If not, then we are at war. We have made ourselves an enemy of God. And we can help you in any way to come at peace with God.